Hi, I'm Chelsea of Friday Pattern Company, and this video is part one of the Saguaro Set Sew Along, and today we're going to be sewing the top. So we'll go over step by step how to do that, and you'll be able to visually see each of the sewing steps, and hopefully that is helpful for you if this is, one of your first sewing projects or something like that. The Saguaro top is really easy to sew. It's just a crop top and it has like a plunging V neckline, and the waist is brought in with elastic. It has an optional front neckline tie to add a little bit more coverage if that's what you want. Before you start this video, you should have taken your measurements, chosen your size, cut out your pattern pieces, made any fit adjustments that you might want to do. A page on our website that breaks down how to do some common fit adjustments for the Saguaro top, and we'll link that down below in case you want to do like a full or small bust adjustment or like increase the center front overlap, things like that. You're gonna want to do those before this video, and then cut the pieces out of your fabric, and then we will go over all of the sewing steps. So before we get started sewing, I just wanted to go over some of the supplies we have. I have a printout of the instructions. This is the fabric I'm going to use. It's actually 100% linen. It looks like denim, but it's not. I've got a scrap of interfacing, fusible interfacing. This is 2-inch wide elastic that will be used for the waistbands, a safety pin, and then you'll just need like your normal sewing tools like pins and scissors and stuff. Before we get started with sewing, we have a couple items of prep work we need to do. So you want to go through and make sure that you've snipped in at each of the notches. Those are reference points for matching things while we sew. So you just want to make sure that you have a little snip there that's about 1/8 to 1/4 inch so that you'll be able to see it, but it's not cut into the seam line. And then we're also going to stay stitch the necklines of the top front and the top back pieces. You do this by sewing 1/4 inch from the edge, and it keeps the necklines that are curved or shaped in some way from stretching out while we're sewing. And here's what that looks like done. We just have a small row of stitches going up that neckline, and we don't have to worry about our pieces getting warped as we sew. One other thing we need to do to prepare to sew our top is that we need to cut our waistband elastic length, and I do have recommended elastic lengths for you in the instructions, but you can also measure this on your body, and I just wanted to show you really quick that you just kind of stretch it around your waist, and I like to put a pin in it and then move around a little bit and kind of like see how it feels on your body. Clearly this was a little bit tight, so I just am gonna repin it and find what feels comfortable for me. You could do this without a shirt on for better accuracy. And then once you know what that length is, you can just cut it and make sure that you have an extra inch in there for seam allowance overlap. This first step is only important if you're going to be adding the optional front ties. So if you are, grab your tie front piece E, and then we're going to press it in half lengthwise. And then once you have that pressed in half, you're going to fold in the raw edges so they meet at that center crease that you just made, and then you're going to press down the length of the tie again. Here that is finished, and then we're just going to fold in one of the short ends about like 1/2 inch, and then you can fold the whole tie in half again lengthwise. And then we'll take it to the machine and we're going to edge stitch it. Here we have our front ties ready to edge stitch, and I've got a couple bonus tips for you. So if you want to clip these corners, it just makes it easier to not have to like work to tuck those raw edges in farther when you're sewing this corner. So you can just like clip off the little corners to make a point that's folded inside of your tie. And then the other thing is that sometimes when you're working with small pieces like this, the feed dogs of your sewing machine want to kind of like pull it down under. So to prevent that from happening, I like to put a little scrap of paper underneath my presser foot and like underneath the tie so that you're sewing right on top of it. And then after you sew, you can just rip this away, and it keeps it from getting pulled down into the feed dogs and causing jams, which are super annoying. And we are edge stitching down the length of this tie, so that just means that we are sewing 1/8 inch from that folded pressed edge that we created, so that this will be sewn into like one fully encased tie that we can put on the front of our top. When you get to the end of your tie and you get to that end where you have the edge folded in, you're going to lower your needle, you're going to lift your presser foot, and then you can rotate the tie so that you just turn and make a nice shift down that short end, which you'll sew and then backstitch. And you'll repeat all these steps on both ties. Now we will attach our ties to our top front A pieces. So you're going to grab your top front A and turn it towards the wrong side, and then we are going to match up the raw edge of our tie with the notch on that neckline, and so you'll just match those up, and then you're going to baste the tie in place at 1/4 inch. And here is what that looks like done. Okay, now we are going to join our top back B piece to our top front A piece at the shoulder seams. So with the right sides of the fabric together, we'll match up that shoulder seam, and you have a notch there to reference, and you'll pin those in place, and then you're going to sew it using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. After that seam is sewn, it needs to be finished, and I'm just going to show you a quick way to finish seams, and that's a zigzag stitch. You can just use like a 2.5 millimeter by 2.5 millimeter zigzag stitch, and you're going to sew it overlapping the raw edge of your seam allowance. This is going to stop it from fraying, and it's definitely important in the sewing process. So I'm just demonstrating a zigzag stitch here, but I do have a serger, and I think that that's the easiest and cleanest way to finish the seams. So I'm going to be finishing the seams in this project with a serger, but I wanted to show you this because you don't need any extra equipment and you can use your regular sewing machine. Once you have both of those seams sewn and finished, you're going to press them towards the back of your top, and here I have that all finished so you can see what it looks like. Now we're going to finish the neckline of our top. So grab your bias tape F pieces, and we're going to pin those right sides together along the little diagonal seam. You'll sew those together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then you'll press that seam open and then trim off the little triangle dog ear thing so that you have one continuous strip. Now you're going to press your bias tape in half lengthwise, and then you'll fold in the raw edges so that they meet at that center crease, and you'll press it again, similar if you added the neckline ties to what you did with your neckline ties. Now we're going to pin the bias tape to the neckline. So I have my top laid out here, right side facing up, and then I'm going to put the bias tape right side facing down so that the right sides together. And then you can open up one of your folded edges of the bias tape and match it up with the raw edge of your neckline. And then just go ahead and pin, or in my case, clip all the way around the neckline. It's okay if you end up with a little bit of extra tape at the end. Depending on your fabric, like your bias tape will be more or less stretchy, and you might have a little bit left over that you'll just trim off at the end. So don't worry too much about it matching up perfectly. And then once it's all set in place, then we can take it over to the machine and you'll sew it using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And now we're going to understitch the bias tape, which means that we press the bias tape out away from the neckline of the top, and the seam allowance also gets pressed out away from the top. And then you're going to sew on the bias tape about 1/8 of an inch from the seam that you just made, catching the seam allowance underneath, and you'll sew all the way around the neckline. And this understitching will make it so that this tape stays folded under and it doesn't want to like roll towards the outside of your top. And here's what that looks like done. As you can see, there's a seam on the bias tape that's holding the seam allowance on the underside. After you finish your understitching, you can press the bias tape towards the wrong side of your top. So you're just going to flip it all the way around and give it a good press. And now we're going to pin it in place so that we can edge stitch it, and then this neckline will have a beautiful finish. And if you added neckline ties to your top, just be aware of them in these steps. You don't want to catch like your loose end in any of these seams. Here is the neckline all finished with its edge stitching, which is just that you sew 1/8 of an inch from that folded edge going all the way around, and it creates this really beautiful finish on our neckline. You only need to do this next step if you had added the neckline ties, but you'll want to fold them out towards the center of your top, and then you're just going to add a little bit of stitching right 1/8 of an inch from your neckline edge to hold the tie in place pointed outward. And you'll want to backstitch, and you can do that on both sides. Here's what that looks like finished, and we're ready to move on. So now you're going to flip your top inside out, and you're going to join front to back along the underarm and side seam, which is this curved seam, and we're going to do it all in one go. So right sides together, we pin those, and we use a 3/8 inch seam allowance to sew them. Here that is done, and because this underarm seam could get bulky if you're using like really thick fabric, we're actually going to trim this seam down to a 1/4 inch before we finish it. Then you're going to finish the seam, and you're going to press it towards the back of your top, and here that is done. And I think this is an exciting step because it's where your saguaro top starts to look like an actual top. Now you're going to overlap your fronts, matching the notches at the waistline, and you can do this left over right or right over left. It does not matter. If you have a preference, go with that. And then you'll just baste using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're going to do the waistband for our top now. So grab your top front waistband C and your top back waistband D, and you will pin those together right sides together along these short seams and join them into a loop. Once your back and front waistbands are joined in a loop, you're going to press those short seams open, and then you can fold your waistband in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, going all the way around the waistband, and then we'll press it again. Here is what that looks like pressed and ready to join to the top. Now keep in mind that these waistbands look really similar, but on the front waistband there is a single notch, and then on the back waistband at the center back there is a double notch. So the double notch is going to go towards the back of our top and the single notch towards. Now we're going to pin our waistband to our top, so you will match up that single notch with the center front, and then the side seams of the waistband will match up with the side seams of the top, and then the double notch will match up with the double notch at the back of your top. Now you can add a couple more pins or clips in to hold this in place if you want. When we sew the waistband to the top, we're going to leave a 2-inch opening so that we can run our elastic through this waistband. So I like to leave a little gap in my pins to remind myself visually to not sew all the way around the waistband edge, because I've done that so many times. And now we're going to press the waistband down away from the top and the seam allowance up towards the top. And we're doing this before we add the elastic in because it's just going to be a lot easier to do now. Here we have that all pressed and ready to go. And I forgot to mention earlier that I like to put the opening on the back body of the top. You're not going to be able to tell where it is once the top is all finished, but just making sure that we preserve the beauty of the front of the top above all else, if that makes sense. And so you're going to grab your waistband elastic length and your safety pin, and you can just pin that to the end of your elastic, and then we're going to run it through this opening and then all the way around our waistband. So you just kind of inch the elastic through, kind of pulling the waistband down as you go, and you just make your way all the way around until you can pull it out the other side. And then once you get your elastic out the other side, you can scooch the fabric of your waistband around, and you want to feel and make sure that nowhere along the way you like twisted your elastic. And then once you're sure that it's not twisted, you can pull the two ends together, and then we will overlap them by about a 1/2 inch, and you can take this to your sewing machine and sew them together, joining them in a loop. And to join the elastic in a loop, I like to just sew like 2 rows of zigzags and make sure to backstitch each of these. It doesn't have to be pretty because this will be totally hidden inside of your waistband. But after that's joined in a loop, you're just going to kind of pull and stretch to get your elastic kind of situated inside of the waistband. And then you're going to take this back over to your machine, and you will sew that little 2-inch opening that you left you're going to sew that shut, and then you are going to finish the waistband seam. Okay, now your waistband is sewn completely shut and that seam is finished, and you're just going to stretch the elastic out, like pull your waistband a bunch of times to make sure that you've got the elastic distributed nicely inside of your waistband, so that it looks even and you don't have like bunching kind of towards the front or towards the back. And once it looks good, we're going to place a bunch of pins going around the waistband, and this will hold the elastic in place while we top stitch it. Now we're going to top stitch our elastic on our waistband, which I know can be a little bit intimidating, but I promise you it's not hard. This first stitch goes 3/8 of an inch from the bottom of our waistband. So I just set it down and I lowered the needle into it and lowered the presser foot. And then once you have that, you're going to stretch your waistband so that your elastic is flat, and you're going to sew in between each set of pins that you placed. And you want to make sure that you're pulling from the front and the back so that you're not relying on your machine, like you're not pulling against your machine, you're pulling against yourself. You're just pulling the elastic taut and slowly sewing around the waistband. And you can go really slow, and you can stop and each time you approach a pin, but I would just make sure that you lower your needle when you stop. So mine does it automatically, but if it doesn't, just before you pull or do anything, just make sure your needle is lowered, because otherwise you could accidentally maybe like pull your project out and like miss some stitches. And then you're going to sew another row of top stitching 3/8 of an inch from the waistband seam, like where your waistband is joined to your top. And a lot of times your presser foot will be 3/8 of an inch wide, but if not, you want to just see where along your presser foot you want to line the seam up with to make sure that you're sewing 3/8 of an inch from that seam. And again, you'll just lower your needle and stretch your elastic flat, and then sew slowly, doing the same thing that you did before. Second row of top stitching is a little bit trickier than the first row because there's a couple thicker spots, like where the two front pieces are overlapping, that might kind of throw you off a tiny bit. But I would just encourage you to not be too hard on yourself about this top stitching being 100% perfect. It's pretty forgiving in the way that it looks. So once everything is gathered in and pressed, you really can't tell if these seams are like perfectly straight. And yeah, I just wouldn't let it discourage you from going for it, because this top stitch elastic, I think, gives this a much more finished look than if it were to just be elastic inside of casing. Here is that top stitching done, and as you can see, it's a little bit like wavy and wonky looking, but when we give this a steamy press at the iron, it's going to look so much better. And here it is after it's been pressed, and it looks so just lovely and neat, and our top is almost finished. All that we have left to do is hem the sleeves. So you're going to turn your top inside out, and then you're going to press the sleeve edge under 3/8 of an inch and give that a good press, and then you'll press it under again another 3/8 of an inch, and then we'll edge stitch it going all the way around. Make sure that when you do this, you keep your seam allowances pressed towards the back body of your top. And here that is done. You'll repeat it on both sides, and then you can just go through and give your garment a nice press and trim away any little threads that are left. And yeah, we are done with the saguaro top. Hooray! And here is the finished top, and it is so cute and comfy. And I'll show how you can wear it with the ties in the front, or you can switch it around to the back. Anyway, I hope this sew along was helpful and fun for you, and stay tuned because next week we're going to be sewing the pants, and obviously you can see a little spoiler alert here. They also turned out cute.